It was the 1930s. Banks were failing, jobs were disappearing, and across the Midwest, men with Thompson submachine guns were becoming national headlines. You remember Dillinger, you remember Bonnie and Clyde, but there were others. Men like Harvey Bailey, who stole over $1 million before federal prison closed in. Eddie Green, the planner behind some of the most dangerous robberies of the era. Verne Miller, a decorated war veteran who became a hired killer. Wilbur Underhill, the so-called Tri-State Terror. Raymond Hamilton, sentenced to 362 years before he was old enough to legally drink. They were hunted, they were feared, and then, slowly, they were forgotten. This is their story. Harvey John Bailey was born on August 23, 1887 in West Virginia. By the time the country entered the Roaring Twenties, Bailey had already stepped into a life that would make him one of the most successful bank robbers in American history. Over the course of his career, he would steal more than $1 million, a staggering sum for the era. Reporters later called him the Dean of American Bank Robbers, a title that reflected his longevity and the scale of his crimes. Bailey robbed his first known bank around 1921 in northwestern North Dakota. The country was changing. Automobiles made quick getaways possible. Small towns often had little more than a local sheriff standing between a robber and a vault. Bailey took advantage of that reality. Throughout the 1920s, he moved from job to job, building a reputation for planning and precision. He avoided the spotlight that followed flashier criminals, preferring efficiency over notoriety. On July 8, 1932, Bailey was incarcerated in Dallas, Texas. His criminal career seemed to be narrowing toward an end behind bars. That changed on June 1, 1933, when he escaped during a prison breakout. During the escape, the warden was kidnapped and used as a human shield. Bailey sustained a bullet wound to the leg during the breakout, an injury that would soon place him in the middle of a federal investigation far larger than any bank robbery. His last bank robbery took place on September 9, 1933, in Kingfisher, Oklahoma. By then, federal authorities were intensifying their pursuit of interstate criminals. The era of loosely coordinated law enforcement was closing, and the newly empowered Bureau of Investigation, soon to become the FBI, was building national cases against men like Bailey. That same year, oilman Charles F. Urschel was kidnapped in Oklahoma City by associates of the criminal known as George Machine Gun Kelly. Urschel's kidnapping became one of the most famous federal cases of the decade. According to crime historian Jay Nash, Bailey was staying in a separate part of the ranch where Urschel was being held. Bailey was reportedly unaware of the kidnapping and unable to travel because of the bullet wound he had suffered during his prison escape. As members of the Kelly gang prepared to leave the ranch, one of the minor participants allegedly visited Bailey and gave him some of the ransom money to help cover medical expenses. When Bailey was later arrested, marked ransom bills from the Urschel kidnapping were found in his possession. That discovery tied him to a crime he maintained he had no part in planning or executing. On October 7, 1933, Bailey was found guilty of complicity in the Urschel kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison. Whether he was knowingly involved or simply entangled by circumstance has remained a matter of debate, but the federal court treated the presence of the marked money as decisive evidence. Bailey was first sent to Leavenworth. On September 1, 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the island prison that housed some of the most notorious federal inmates of the era. In 1946, he was returned to Leavenworth. In 1960, he was transferred again, this time to the Federal Correctional Institution in Seagoville, Texas. After decades behind bars, Bailey was released on March 30, 1964. His name has occasionally surfaced in discussions about the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago. One of the men long suspected in that killing was Fred Killer Burke. In his 1973 autobiography, Bailey insisted that he and Burke were planning a bank robbery in Calumet City, Illinois, roughly 20 miles south of the massacre site, at the time the killings occurred. There is no definitive evidence placing Bailey at the massacre, and his claim remains part of the historical record without conclusive resolution. In 1966, Bailey married Esther Farmer, the widow of Herbert Allen Deffy Farmer. After his release, he worked as a woodworker in a furniture factory, living quietly far from the banks and prison yards that had defined his earlier life. Harvey John Bailey died peacefully in Joplin, Missouri, on March 1, 1979. He was 91 years old. His life stretched from the horse and buggy era into the modern age, and along the way he became a symbol of a time when bank robbers could cross state lines faster than the law could follow. The legend surrounding him was built on numbers and prison transfers, but the record shows a man who spent much of his long life paying for the decisions he made in the early years of America's most violent decade. Raymond Hamilton was born on May 21, 1914, in a tent along the banks of the Deep Fork River in Oklahoma. His father, John Henry Hamilton, left the family when Raymond was 10 years old. His mother, Sarah Alice Bullock, moved her children to West Dallas, Texas. Raymond grew up there with his older brother Floyd Hamilton and 4 sisters, Lily, Lucy, Margie, and Audrey. Little is documented about his early childhood beyond poverty and instability. He skipped school frequently and drifted into petty theft. In West Dallas, he met a young man named Clyde Barrow. They lived in the same neighborhood, 2 boys growing up in a section of the city that would later be tied to some of the most violent crimes of the Depression era. By his late teens, Hamilton was already moving in and out of jail. By the time he was 20 years old, courts had handed down sentences that added up to 362 years. Hamilton eventually joined the group that came to be known as the Barrow Gang, led by Clyde Barrow and his partner Bonnie Parker. On August 5, 1932, in Stringtown, Oklahoma, Hamilton and Barrow were present when Deputy Sheriff Eugene C. Moore and Sheriff Charlie Maxwell approached them at an outdoor dance. The group had drawn attention as sharply dressed strangers in a small town. When the officers intervened, gunfire erupted. Deputy Moore was killed. Sheriff Maxwell was shot 6 times but survived. It was the first time Barrow and Hamilton were involved in the killing of a law enforcement officer. Hamilton's relationship with the gang was unstable. He was close to his girlfriend, Mary O'Dare, the sister of Odell Chambliss, an early associate of Clyde Barrow. Tensions within the group surfaced when Mary reportedly suggested incapacitating Clyde and leaving with money from the gang's robberies. Bonnie Parker informed Clyde of the conversation. Around the same time, Clyde observed Hamilton pocketing some of the gang's money. Distrust followed. In January 1934, while Hamilton was imprisoned at the Eastern Prison Farm near Huntsville, Texas, Bonnie and Clyde staged a breakout on January 16th. They freed Hamilton and 4 other inmates. During the escape, fellow prisoner Joe Palmer mortally wounded guard M.J. Croson. Croson's death intensified the pursuit of the gang. Texas Prison System Chief Lee Simmons issued a shoot-to-kill order against Barrow and Parker. Former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer was hired to track them down. After disputes within the group, Hamilton separated from the Barrow gang. He was recaptured on April 25, 1934. Less than a month later, on May 23, 1934, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were ambushed and killed by Hamer's posse in Louisiana. Hamilton was in prison at the time. He escaped again and joined forces with former Barrow associate Ralph Fultz. In February 1935, the 2 burglarized a National Guard armory in Beaumont, Texas, stealing 2 Thompson's submachine guns. On February the 24th, after stealing a car in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they headed back toward Texas. They avoided capture in McKinney, Texas, after disarming members of a pursuing posse. On March 10, 1935, Hamilton and Fultz gave an interview to Houston reporter Harry McCormick. They spoke about conditions within the Texas prison system, describing them as brutal. To prevent McCormick from being charged with harboring fugitives, they staged the meeting to resemble a kidnapping and left him tied up. Hamilton left his fingerprints behind to confirm his identity. On April 5, 1935, Hamilton was recaptured in a Fort Worth rail yard. He had sent a note to his sister in Dallas. The note was intercepted by Dallas deputy Bill Decker. Decker, along with other deputies and Fort Worth detective Chester Reagan, searched the rail yard. They found Hamilton lying on the tracks near the East First Street overpass among several transient men. He was wearing dirty overalls and carrying 2.45 caliber pistols, with a suitcase of new clothes beside him. When Decker confronted him at gunpoint, Hamilton surrendered. The following day, hundreds gathered at the courthouse in Dallas to see the man labeled Public Enemy Number 1. Hamilton was tried and convicted for his role in the killing of prison guard M.J. Crowson during the Eastham escape. He was sentenced to death. On May 10, 1935, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, he was executed in the electric chair. Witnesses said he walked calmly to the chair and said, "Well, goodbye all." He was 20 years old, 11 days short of his 21st birthday. Joe Palmer, the man who had fired the fatal shot at Crowson, had been executed shortly before him. Hamilton never publicly admitted to killing anyone. In private, he told his brother Floyd that during the 1932 shooting of Deputy Eugene Moore, both he and Clyde were firing, and he could not say whose bullet had struck the officer. Hamilton was also convicted in the May 1, 1932 murder of John Bucker in Hillsborough, Texas, though later accounts identified Ted Rogers as the actual killer, with Clyde Barrow and Johnny Russell as accomplices. Raymond Hamilton's life moved quickly from poverty to prison yards, from rail yards to the electric chair. He came of age in a time when young men with guns could gain headlines overnight. By 20, he had accumulated sentences that would have kept him locked away for centuries. Instead, his life ended in less than 2 decades, another name in the federal government's expanding list of public enemies. Harold Eugene Green was born on November 2nd, 1898, in Pueblo, Colorado. His father died when he was 3 years old, leaving his mother to raise Eugene and his brothers, James and Frank. By the time he reached adulthood, Green had already begun drifting into crime. And over the years, he would use a string of aliases that reflected a life lived in motion. Police records list him as Eugene Green, George Graham, Charles Ryan, George Green, Fred Rogg, and Frederick Riley. His criminal record began early. On August 11, 1916, under the name Eugene Green, he was arrested in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for grand larceny and sentenced to 6 months in the House of Corrections. In July 1921, using the name George Graham, he was arrested in St. Paul, Minnesota, on investigation. In Minneapolis, he was picked up as Fred Rogg, suspected of auto theft, and received a suspended 90-day sentence. On July 17, 1922, St. Paul police arrested him again for robbery, though he was released. Weeks later, in Des Moines, Iowa, under the name Frederick Riley, he was arrested on investigation as a suspected auto thief and safe blower and identified as a fugitive from Minneapolis. He was released again. That pattern changed on November 15, 1922, when, as Eddie Green, he was received at the Minnesota State Reformatory in St. Cloud on a first-degree robbery charge. He was sentenced to 40 years. He served 5. On July 26, 1923, he was transferred to the Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater. Prison records describe a man who studied systems, habits, and weaknesses. After parole, Green worked occasionally in iron mills, but his real skill was as a jug marker, a term used for the man who selected banks, studied layouts, and designed escape routes. He cased targets personally. He drove the roads in advance. He cultivated contacts with corrupt politicians and police officials in St. Paul, a city that had a long reputation as a refuge for criminals willing to pay for protection. Through those connections, Green helped arrange safe houses and early warnings about raids. On January 28, 1933, he took part in his first major robbery of the Depression era. Alongside Earl Doyle, Thomas Buck Wolfe, and Howard Dago Lansdon, Green robbed a bank messenger in North Kansas City, Missouri, stealing $14,500. A shootout followed. Marshal Edgar Norl and Wolfe were wounded. A pursuing posse made up largely of local residents chased them. The gang escaped by stealing one of the posse's cars. Green and his partners fled into Iowa. They stole spare license plates from 2 vehicles and kidnapped Knoxville police officers Bert Conry and John Newman to aid their escape. On January 29, 1933, the hostages were released in Unionville, Missouri. Wolfe, who had been shot in the groin, was left behind and later arrested at a hospital in Coffeyville, Kansas. He died soon after being transferred to the county jail in Liberty, Missouri. 3 months later, on April 4, 1933, Green joined a larger group to rob a bank in Fairbury, Nebraska. Among them were Frank Jelly Nash, Volney Davis, Arthur Barker, Fred Barker, and Alvin Karpis, men who would later be identified with what became known as the Barker-Karpis Gang. Jess Doyle and Earl Chrisman also took part. Chrisman was badly wounded during the robbery. Green drove him to a Kansas City house associated with Verne Miller so he could recover. Chrisman died from his wounds and was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city. Green eventually grew dissatisfied with the Barker brothers' methods. By late 1933, he was associating with Lester Babyface Nelson, Tommy Carroll, and Homer Van Meter. In early 1934, he joined the reorganized gang led by John Dillinger. On March 6, 1934, the group robbed a bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, taking $49,500. The crew included Dillinger, Carroll, Van Meter, Nelson, and Green. During the robbery, motorcycle officer Hale Keith was shot 4 times in the chest by Nelson, who fired through a plate glass window. A week later, in Mason City, Iowa, Green and Van Meter had carefully cased a bank that was estimated to hold $250,000. Green prepared diagrams and mapped escape routes. The gang ultimately took around $52,000. They seized 25 hostages to facilitate their getaway. During the escape, Dillinger and John Red Hamilton were both wounded in the shoulder. An innocent bystander was also shot after Nelson mistook him for a police officer. Afterwards, the gang returned to St. Paul. Green arranged a safe house for Dillinger and Van Meter. Federal agents had been tracking Dillinger for months. On March 31, 1934, agents raided the hideout. A gunfight erupted. Dillinger was wounded, but escaped. When agents later searched Dillinger's abandoned apartment, they found a telephone number. It led them to another Green hideout in St. Paul. On April 3, 1934, Green and his common-law wife Bessie arrived at that safe house. Green stepped from the car and approached the apartment. Federal agents armed with Thompson submachine guns were waiting. Green was shot in the head and shoulder. The Bureau stated that Green had assumed a threatening attitude accompanied by menacing gestures. Press accounts raised questions about whether he had been attempting to flee or had been shot without warning. The controversy drew criticism toward the FBI and temporarily slowed its pursuit of Dillinger. Green was taken to a hospital in St. Paul. He remained alive for 7 days, drifting in and out of delirium. Federal agents recorded his statements during that period. According to later accounts, information obtained from Green revealed details about the St. Paul underworld and the structure of the Barker-Karpis organization. His statements, along with information provided by Bessie Green while she was held for harboring him, helped confirm the involvement of Alvin Karpis and the Barker brothers in the January 1934 kidnapping of Edward Bremer. She also named participants connected to earlier kidnappings, including references to local figure Harry Sawyer, who was described as a liaison between police and visiting gangs. Harold Eugene Eddie Green died on April 10, 1934, in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was 35 years old. In the span of 2 decades, he had moved from small-time theft to the inner circle of some of the most notorious criminals of the Depression era. His strength was not bravado. It was preparation. He studied targets, cultivated protection, and understood how cities functioned behind closed doors. In the end, it was a telephone number written down in a hurry that brought federal agents to his door. Vernon C. Miller was born on August 25, 1896, in Kimball, South Dakota, into a family of Scotch-Irish descent. In 1914, he moved to Huron, about 35 miles away, and found work as an auto mechanic. 2 years later, he enlisted in the United States Army and took part in the Pancho Villa expedition into Mexico. When the United States entered World War I, Miller deployed to France with the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Brigade Combat Team, 1st U.S. Infantry Division, American Expeditionary Forces. He was decorated with the Croix de Guerre by the government of the Third French Republic for courage under enemy fire, and rose to the rank of Colour Sergeant by the time of the armistice in 1918. When he returned home, Miller joined the Huron Police Department as a patrolman. In May 1920, he resigned and ran for sheriff of Beadle County. He won the election in November. Within 2 years, he left the office under a cloud. In early 1922, he fled the area after stealing $2,600 in county funds. Investigators tracked him down, and on April 4, 1923, he was convicted of embezzlement. At the South Dakota State Penitentiary, Miller became the warden's personal chauffeur. He was paroled in November 1924. By then, Prohibition had transformed the Midwest into a battleground for bootleggers and racketeers. Miller entered that world quickly. In October 1925, a Sioux Falls court fined him $200 for bootlegging. For several years afterward, he avoided major convictions, though his name continued to circulate in criminal circles. By the late 1920s, Miller's life had begun to fray. Reports from the period describe heavy drug use and advanced syphilis. Associates described sudden outbursts of violence. On February 3, 1928, he was indicted for wounding 2 Minneapolis police officers, though the case was dropped for lack of evidence. As Prohibition neared its end, Miller was known as a freelance gunman across the Midwest. His marksmanship was widely discussed in underworld circles. Declassified files later indicated that he carried out contract killings for figures linked to Murder, Inc., the Purple Gang of Detroit, and the Chicago outfit associated with Al Capone. These connections placed him in contact with some of the most powerful organized crime groups of the era. On May 31, 1930, Eugene "Red" McLaughlin, the brother of a friend of Miller's, was killed by members of the Chicago outfit, and his body was found in a Chicago canal. The following day, June 1, 1930, Miller tracked 3 suspected participants to a resort hotel in Fox Lake, Illinois, and shot them dead. The killings became known as the Fox Lake Massacre and were initially attributed to George Moran's North Side Gang. That same summer, Miller turned back to bank robbery. On July 15, 1930, he joined Harvey Bailey, George "Machine Gun" Kelly, and others in a daylight raid on a bank in Wilmar, Minnesota, stealing $70,000. Less than a month later, on August 13th, after a dispute over what was described as a double cross from the Wilmar robbery, Miller killed Frank Wayne Coleman, Mike Rusick, and Jew Sammy Stein. Their bodies were dumped at White Bear Lake. The violence did not end his association with his accomplices. On September 9, 1930, Miller again worked with Bailey, Kelly, and others in robbing a bank in Ottumwa, Iowa, taking $40,000. On April 8, 1931, Miller, Bailey, Kelly, Frank, Jelly Nash, and several others robbed a bank in Sherman, Texas, for another $40,000. On December 16, 1932, during a bank robbery in Minneapolis, 2 police officers were killed by members of Miller's group. After the Sherman robbery, Miller shifted his focus primarily to murder for hire, though he maintained contact with former partners. Through those connections, including Chicago mobster Louis Stachey, he was drawn into a plan to free Frank Nash from federal custody. Nash was being transported to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. On June 17, 1933, at Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri, gunmen ambushed federal agents during Nash's transfer. The shootout that followed became known as the Kansas City Massacre. Nash and 4 law enforcement officers were killed. 2 more officers were wounded. Miller was the only gunman definitively identified at the scene. Although FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly named Charles Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Richetti as participants, the identities of the other gunmen were never conclusively established. Within the underworld, Miller's role carried consequences. According to later accounts, Murder, Inc. leader Lepke Buchalter indicated that Miller had become a liability. After the Kansas City Massacre, Miller fled east and stayed with New Jersey mobster Abner Longy Zwillman in Orange, New Jersey. The arrangement ended after Miller killed one of Zwillman's gunmen during an argument. On October 23, 1933, Miller traveled to Chicago, posing as a salesman for an optical supply house, while staying with his girlfriend Vi Mathias. On November 1st, federal agents raided her apartment. Miller exchanged gunfire with the agents and escaped. On November 29, 1933, a motorist discovered Miller's body in a roadside ditch outside Detroit, Michigan. He had been beaten repeatedly with a claw hammer and partially strangled with a clothesline. The killing bore the signs of a contract murder. The precise motive remains uncertain. Historians have suggested retaliation for the Kansas City Massacre, revenge for earlier killings, or punishment for internal disputes. Former associate George Machine Gun Kelly later stated that whoever killed Miller must have been someone he trusted, because Miller rarely allowed anyone close to him while unarmed. FBI agent Verne Hamilton told reporters that while agents had wanted Miller, whoever killed him had removed that burden. In his memoirs, agent Melvin Purvis wrote that the underworld treated crime as business and that Miller had become a liability after Kansas City. Despite his long record of violence and criminal activity, Verne Miller was buried in White Lake, South Dakota, with full military honors and an American Legion honor guard. He had been a decorated soldier before he became a hired gun. His life traced a path from the battlefields of France to the blood-stained platforms of a Missouri train station. By the time he was 37 years old, the same underworld that once paid him for his aim had decided he was worth more dead than alive. Wilbur Underhill Jr. was born on March 16, 1901, in Joplin, Missouri, one of 7 children. 3 of his older brothers, Earl, George, and Ernest, would spend much of their lives in and out of prison. His sisters chose a different path. When Wilbur was 12 years old, his brother George killed a local peanut vendor and received a life sentence. Those who knew the family later said that event marked a shift in Wilbur. His mother blamed a childhood accident, claiming it left him not quite right. Around that time, he changed the spelling of his name from Wilbur to Wilbur, believing it sounded tougher. His first offense was small. He stole silverware from a neighbor and tried to convince police that a stranger had given it to him. In 1918, he was convicted of burglary and sentenced to 4 years in prison. After his release, he gained local notoriety as the Lover's Lane Bandit, targeting couples parked in secluded areas. A police decoy operation led to his capture, and he was sentenced to 5 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary. Paroled in late 1926, Underhill headed to Oklahoma. On Christmas Day of that year, he and Ike Skeet Akins robbed a drugstore in Ocmulgee. During the robbery, a 19-year-old customer named George Fee was killed. Underhill and Akins were arrested on January 7, 1927, and charged with murder and armed robbery. While awaiting trial, they escaped from the Ocmulgee jail on January 30th with fellow inmates Red Gann and Duff Kennedy using hacksaws that had been smuggled in. Akins was captured in Lamar, Missouri on February 9th. 3 days later, while being transported back to Ocmulgee, he attempted another escape and was shot and killed by Sheriff John Russell. Underhill remained at large. The day after Akins' death, Underhill robbed a movie theater in Pitcher, Oklahoma, taking $52. When confronted by Constable George Fuller, Underhill seized Fuller's pistol and shot a deputized civilian, Earl O'Neill, before fleeing. He was captured in Panama, Oklahoma on March 20th, 1927. On June 3rd, 1927, he was convicted of the murder of George Fee and sentenced to life imprisonment at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Underhill attempted escape several times and finally succeeded on July 14th, 1931. 12 days later, using the name Ralph Carraway, he bought a car in Cherryvale, Kansas, and robbed a theater that same day. In August, he recruited his nephew, Frank Underhill, to join him. On August 12th, they robbed a gas station in Wichita, Kansas, netting less than $15. Fleeing the scene, Underhill crashed their car and checked into a hotel. The next day, patrolman Merle Culver came to their room as part of a routine check of local hotels. When Culver knocked, Underhill shot him 3 times in the head. Culver died instantly. Underhill ran into the street and exchanged gunfire with police. During the chaos, a 2-year-old boy was killed in the crossfire when officers fired at Underhill. He was eventually stopped by a gunshot wound to the neck. Convicted of murder once again, Underhill received another life sentence and was sent to Lansing State Prison in Kansas on September 4th, 1931. His nephew Frank was not charged and never returned to crime. On May 30th, 1933, Underhill escaped from Lansing during a mass breakout involving 10 other inmates. The escape was aided by pistols smuggled in by Frank "Jelly" Nash. Among those who fled were Harvey Bailey, Jim Clark, Ed Davis, Robert Big Bob Brady, and others. Many of these men regrouped in the Cookson Hills of eastern Oklahoma, an area known for harboring outlaws. Together with Bailey, Underhill co-led what became known as the Bailey-Underhill Gang. On June 16, 1933, Underhill and Bailey led a bank robbery in Black Rock, Arkansas. The following day, their names were mistakenly linked in press reports to the Kansas City Massacre, the failed attempt to free Frank Nash that left Nash and 4 lawmen dead. There is no verified evidence placing Underhill at Union Station. The gang continued robbing banks across Oklahoma and Kansas. They stole $11,000 from a bank in Clinton, Oklahoma. Underhill carried out a robbery in Canton, Kansas, before rejoining the group for a robbery in Kingfisher, Oklahoma on August 9, 1933. 3 days later, Harvey Bailey was arrested at a Texas ranch owned by the father-in-law of George Machine Gun Kelly. Bailey was later convicted in connection with the kidnapping of oilman Charles Urschel. With Bailey imprisoned, Underhill assumed control of the gang. On October 6, 1933, Underhill and accomplices robbed a bank in Baxter Springs, Kansas, taking $3,000. More robberies followed in Galena, Kansas, and Stuttgart, Arkansas. On November 9th, Underhill and Ford Bradshaw robbed a bank in Okmulgee, escaping with $13,000. Newspapers began calling him Mad Dog and the Tri-State Terror. A special task force equipped with armored cars searched the Cookson Hills. On November 18th, while officers were still combing the hills, Underhill appeared at the courthouse in Colgate, Oklahoma, and applied for a marriage license under his real name. He married Hazel Jarrett Hudson, sister of the Jarrett brothers, who were themselves known in outlaw circles. Shortly afterward, Underhill and associates robbed a bank in Frankfort, Kentucky. Frustrated by the lack of progress from local authorities, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover assigned agent R. H. Colvin to the case. Colvin discovered that Underhill had provided his wife's Oklahoma City address to the minister who married them. Agents staked out the residence and spotted the couple, but they left before reinforcements arrived. Another raid on a farm near Kanawha failed when Underhill unknowingly passed officers on the highway and escaped. On December 11, 1933, Underhill, Jack Lloyd, and Ralph Rowe attempted to burglarize a bank in Harrah, Oklahoma. 2 days later, they robbed another bank in Colgate. On December 26, 1933, Underhill and his new wife were staying in a rented cottage in Shawnee, Oklahoma, along with Ralph Rowe and Rowe's girlfriend Eva Mae Nichols. On December 30th, a 24-man strike force of federal agents, state troopers, and local police surrounded the house. The group was led by R. H. Colvin and Frank Smith, a survivor of the Kansas City Massacre. When officers called for surrender, Underhill opened fire. A gun battle erupted. Eva Nichols was killed during the exchange. Underhill, barefoot and wearing only his underwear, ran from the house and was shot multiple times. He managed to travel 16 blocks before breaking into a furniture store and collapsing on a bed. Rowe was wounded and arrested. Hazel Underhill was taken into custody. Underhill was transported to McAllister and placed in the prison hospital, handcuffed to his bed. He died from his wounds on January 6, 1934. He was 32 years old. According to reports, his final words were, "Tell the boys I'm coming home." After his death, members of his gang, led by Ford Bradshaw, drove into the town of Vian and fired shots in retaliation. The act achieved little beyond hardening public opinion. Within months, Bradshaw and other associates were dead or in custody. Wilbur Underhill Jr. spent most of his adult life in prison or on the run. His record included multiple murders, bank robberies across several states, and 2 life sentences. By the winter of 1933, federal authorities were building coordinated strike forces to deal with men like him. The era of loosely connected posses was ending. Underhill's death marked another step in that transition, as the government expanded its reach and the list of so-called public enemies grew shorter.